Thank you very much. And very glad to be here. Let's see if we got everything's working, I think, there. All right. So, welcome, folks. Dan Kalish here, and we are going to do a lab interpretation workshop on. So, this is heavy on the workshop and heavy on the interpretation and light on the science. So, leave it to all the science folks at Doctors Data to educate you all about that. And I'm more of the what do we do in practice guy, you know? And I want to thank Doctors Data for putting this on because I love to talk about adrenal hormones, one of my favorite topics. We already kind of covered off on me, but I haven't been in practice. This is my 30th year. Can you believe that? Time has flown by. We've trained thousands of doctors, done a lot of stuff throughout the field of functional medicine. And it's a really exciting time right now to see the growth of the industry is so phenomenal. It's just a wonderful thing. And then we have some classes coming up. If you guys are interested, we have we have a huge number of classes at the Kalish Institute all the time, but we have this Business Essentials Boot Camp, which is one of our more popular classes coming up in February. If you're interested, you get a discount if you're from Doctors Data. But you can check out our website or talk to our folks on staff about the different classes that we offer. And we do teach a lot of stuff about adrenal hormones too, if you're interested in learning more about what we're talking about tonight. Happy to have you guys join us for one of those courses too, okay? So the starting point here is just like, how do you assess this on the patient level? And I have my fat, fatigued, and depressed spiel that I give to, when we're doing a lot of these training programs. So depression on the rise, obesity, this is just a little obesity map from the CDC where you can see if things are getting red, it's getting bad, right? There's 2011. But by the way, there's no red in 2011, right? Just orangey. Orangey is bad. It was only 10 years ago. Oh, there's some orangey reddish stuff. I mean, this is just the population getting fatter in front of our eyes, more and more obesity. And then they had to invent a new color in 2019. That's not good, right? This is metabolic disease spreading. Talk about an epidemic. That's an epidemic, right? Look at this again, one more time. This is just in the last few years. This is like, I can remember 2011. That wasn't that long ago. Okay, here's 2011. No reddy color, dark reddy color at all. And here's the disease spreading, the disease of metabolic disorders. Look at that, just boom, 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 boom. And it's not slowing down even a little bit. And here's where we are now, right? So when we're thinking about cortisol, and thinking about the adrenal glands, I think about blood sugar regulation and insulin resistance and cortisol's role as a glucocorticosteroid, i.e., this whole metabolic syndrome type thing and how it plays into that. Think about its role in an anti-inflammatory, immune boosting way and how it helps us fight off various different bugs that the body's trying to deal with. Think about it in relation to emotional stress factors, right? There's all these different variables that can cause people to have pretty major problems with their adrenal hormones. And historically, there have been a few different ways to test for it. So we've had the salivary testing around for a long, long time. And now we've got urinary testing and these urinary metabolites that give a much broader and more comprehensive overview of what's happening with all these different hormones. And you can also, with the HuMap test, in addition to doing sort of the standard, we might call it old-fashioned cortisol and DHEA assessment, also look at all these other variables. And we're not talking about them tonight. We're really just going to hone in on the cortisol and DHEA portion of this test so that we can get to the interpretation part and I can get to the protocol part so you can have something to take home with you to use. And then we're probably covering, 2% or 5% of the information on this particular lab, but it's a really nice set of tools to have in your toolbox. If you can interpret the cortisol and DHEA levels and set up an adrenal hormone balancing program for someone, you can obviously then over the years fill in all the other information and all these other markers on the test. Okay, and the test has been set up in a color-coded way. I would suggest flipping through, a few of these samples, first, and then you can start to get a sense of how this is actually arranged because it's kind of a unique, but when you understand it, very easy to understand at a glance kind of setup. Okay, when we look at the labs, we'll get into more specifics on this, but they're color-coded and not color-coded in a typical way. They're color-coded, meaning red is high, the blue at the bottom is low, okay? But just because a level is high or low doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. So oftentimes with lab reports, we're used to red always being a negative, And, the non-red colors being, yellow is usually like borderline bad. Red is always extra bad. So in this case, with this type of test, you have to just sort of let go of that old model and realize that red means high, blue means low, and then this will all make sense. Okay. And then here's some examples also of when on the front page, let me go back here and you can see on the front page of the test, you get the summary, the left-hand sort of rainbow-looking structure on the left-hand side, right? Now, when we're looking at a series of those together, you can clearly see that, oh, wait a minute, there's different configurations here. It's not always as a certain amount of red, always a certain amount of green or blue. Patient to patient, depending on what their profile looks like, it's going to be quite different. So a patient that has this whole huge blue arc, those are all the low markers. Patient that has this, like patient 3, this red arc at the very beginning, those are the high markers. So right off the bat, when you see this, once you get used to this color coding system, I think you guys will like it a lot because it gives you a ton of information immediately upon looking at the test. All right, so we'll come back to labs in a minute. I'm just going to give a short little presentation on how I educate patients around this work. So all these talks that I do are spoken in the language with which I speak to patients. Again, you can get all the science and information from other folks, but I try to teach the practical application stuff. So when I'm sitting down with the patient and talking about adrenal hormones, I'll say there's 3 major sources of stress that we're concerned about: emotional, dietary, and inflammatory stresses. And the adrenal hormones respond to all 3 of these. Emotional stress could be death or divorce in the family, something like that going on. Dietary stress, that looks like, I don't really like donuts that much. I like donuts a little bit, but I hate sprinkles and I hate the pink kind. So that's not particularly appetizing to me. But if that was a chocolate donut, I'd be thinking that looks pretty good. So dietary stress, and it's not, it's almost always carbohydrate excess and how we develop insulin resistance and the blood sugar fluctuations that come about from that, right? That's almost always the problem with the diet. And then pain and hidden inflammation. And so emotional stress, you can talk to people and figure out what it is. Dietary stress is lifestyle coaching. And then for the hidden inflammation component, you would want to do GI testing, environmental toxin testing, and figure out what are the other variables going on. So in the Kalish Method Institute, when I teach these courses, the 1-year-long courses, we do on every new patient an adrenal lab, a GI lab and GI 360, right? And then a toxin screen or looking at detoxification pathways. So those 3 tests paired together are what I consider like a basic patient workup. And the adrenals are responding to the inflammatory issues and the dietary issues and the toxin issues also. So it's not enough just to do an adrenal test. So the adrenals, to a certain extent, are the center of a lot of different problems. And this is just a fancy way of saying that the stress response has an impact on our brain and on our metabolism and on on our other hormone levels. And what we find when we correct the adrenal hormone imbalances is that a lot of things get better. It's really quite shocking. It's always surprising to me. And it's been surprising to me for 30 years. But now I've taught, every year I teach a couple hundred people these protocols. And it's wonderful to watch them go through the same experience of, wow, I can't believe how well this stuff works. The only time that people get frustrated, and I'll warn you about this now, is if you don't do it enough times. So you got to order 10 labs. Just deal with it. Okay, order 10 of these HuMap labs on 10 different patients, and don't pick really hard patients. That's not fair. Pick easy patients, order 10 of them, use these protocols, and you'll find probably half or more of them start to get better. If you pick your hardest patients, or if you pick your hardest patients, or if you just pick like 1 or 2 really hard patients and run a HuMap test and run these protocols, they may not get better. Okay, so you have to have enough volume of experience with this before you see how well it works. And so I encourage a high volume of testing for people to learn this. We had our absolute winner of all time. It was Dr. Michael Winters. He took the mentorship like 10 or 12 years ago. And he did this is true. He did in the first month of the mentorship, he tested 50 people, 50 people. We had a whole day of Michael Winters' lab review. Usually, doctors submit like 1 test. He had 50 of them. But you know what? At the end of a month or 2, he totally understand what he was doing. So don't be a onesie twosie person. Just don't order 1 lab on the hardest patient and then wait 6 months and order another one. Get 10 of them in, on relatively easy patients, you'll start to see how well this stuff works. That's probably the biggest barrier to adoption of lab testing that we see is patients don't order enough labs in a short enough period of time on the right people to really get how well this stuff works. Okay. Because once you see how well it works, you're going to use it the rest of your career. I guarantee you that. Healing, the vital, restoring vitality in 3 steps. So addressing the hormone component, diet and digestion. We're doing these other things too. I don't want to think it's all, you do think it's all about the adrenals only. And then on the stress hormone system side, I just want to point out there's other things going on too, right? So we've got the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary connecting to the adrenals. And we're focusing tonight on the DHEA and cortisol side, but there's also a neurotransmission side to all this, the catecholamines, the dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. There's other types of tests you can do through doctor's data for those kinds of problems. We're not talking about them today, but they're should be coordinated with this too, I guess, in a sense. And sometimes the brain or neurotransmitter programs may be more important. Sometimes the adrenal programs are more important. And most often you can run them side by side. You can do them together. Now, when you think about, from a patient education standpoint, what's the sort of simplest message that you can give around cortisol? It would be cortisol's role in the circadian rhythm. And just a simple explanation and showing a diagram like this saying, hey, when your cortisol, when you wake up in the morning, your cortisol peaks to quite a high level, and it's supposed to drop gradually throughout the day, be at its lowest levels at night. The dropping of cortisol allows for the expression of human growth hormone and all the healing and repair and rest and restoration that happens in the evening hours happens as cortisol goes down. And so when we run these labs for cortisol, we want to see how close to in sync with this natural rhythm you are. And this natural rhythm is largely controlled by our exposure to light and dark. So there's not a lot of negotiating in this. It's not like you could have your own personal cortisol circadian rhythm. This is hardwired by our exposure to light and dark. And so it kind of stuck with it. And when we look at the labs in a few minutes, you want to have this imprinted in the back of your mind here. This is the normal rhythm. How far off is my patient from this normal rhythm? And how can I get my patient back into this normal rhythm? And when you do, and people have super high, super low levels, and you bring them back into the normal, they start to feel the normal ranges. They start to feel better pretty quickly. It's quite a beautiful thing to see. When cortisol goes up, it lowers serotonin, it raises catecholamines, it depletes the sex hormones. So it has body-wide effects, and it has effects on other systems of the body as well. And there's also, as I mentioned earlier, the cortisol catecholamine connection. So obviously when you're stressed and cortisol goes up, you're also going to have a excessive release of the catecholamines. So at some point you want to take some conferences or webinars or whatever about the catecholamine side. So you can use your tyrosine and those kind of supplements to balance out epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine in parallel with or in conjunction with the work that you're doing with cortisol. And then lifestyle stressors, there's 4 of the major lifestyle factors that we think about: eating, diet / stuff, exercise, too much, too little, lack of sleep, poor quality sleep, and then emotional stressors. And so usually part of an initial adrenal program that's well designed is to address one of the lifestyle factors and make sure that you get the person on track. It's usually too much for people to handle more than one. I usually start with diet. So that means that in the beginning of their adrenal program, they're also given a diet that's appropriate depending on what you're trying to do, right? If they only need to gain weight or lose weight, or if they're vegan or they're meat eater, or there's a lot of different variables there, but you want to make sure that you're getting the food connection coordinated with the adrenal supplements. So it's not just about supplements. And then next on the target list, if possible, and sometimes before food we even do this, is to figure out the sleep cycle, because the adrenal glands will only really heal and repair once the sleep cycle is normalized. And so that becomes a very top priority for people. Usually, I would say the most important, but usually we save it for last, is getting people into the right exercise pattern. And exercise conveys a sense of almost invincibility to people. Once people are physically fit, they're going to be staying healthy. But it's very hard usually for our chronically ill patients to just, jump out of bed in the morning and start working out. Usually they're struggling with the jump out of bed part. It's not like they're going to be going to a CrossFit gym 7 days a week, just because you told them to exercise. So usually that happens towards the end of these programs, maybe towards the end of a 6-month protocol. But it is, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important part of all this, is the exercise component. Okay, so then when we're looking at these labs, we're trying to see, is there a stage 1 or 2 or 3 going on? And the dosages of the products that I recommend are slightly different depending on the stage. Some of the products are completely different depending on the level of cortisol. So a high cortisol can be lowered with specific products like phosphorine. A low cortisol can be raised with specific products like licorice root. Not DGL, not the D-glycerinated licorice root, but regular old licorice root. And there's also general products that are given for low DHEA and high or low cortisol to balance them out. And I'll show you that when we get to the protocol part. But just to mention that it's helpful to be able to tell, are you focusing on lowering cortisol or raising it? Because the products are going to be a little different depending on what you're using. And here they are, the 3 stages, right? In a normal phase there, cortisol can go up and go down, but it resets itself back to normal on a normal day. So if you have a normal HPA axis on a really stressful day, your cortisol would, of course, be really high. So would your DHEA. They would both go up together. But then, let's say the next day, the stress is over, then they would reset. You might have a low cortisol day after a high cortisol day, but then a few days after that, it would come back to normal. In fact, I did this experiment on myself about 25 years ago because I was working at one of these labs and had access to free testing. And I thought this was kind of clever. I just did an adrenal lab every day for 7 days in a row. I was like, because patients were always asking me, how, is this different on different days or how accurate are these tests? I was like, I don't know, let's just try this. Some of the people I was working with actually did a test every day for 30 days in a row, but that was a little too much. Anyways, I did a week. And on my testing, the days that I worked, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I had long patient days. I had super high cortisol, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Fridays, when I didn't work, it crashed and was really low. And I'm thinking, that's not good. On Saturdays, it came up a little bit. On Sundays, it came up a lot. And on Mondays, my cortisol was back to normal. So I created this 3-day work intensity extravaganza in my own life where I saw patients 3 days a week, super high cortisol. But over the weekends, it turned out I recovered. And by Mondays, I was back to normal. So you can have high and low cortisol up and down. If you get enough rest and repair, the equation balances out. But what we're worried about is when people go into a stage 1, now the cortisols are high, but they're not dropping back down. They're high every day. It's not 3 days of high cortisol like I had, and then 4 days of recovery. It's 7 days a week of high cortisol. It's, what is that? That's like a bad marriage. Bad marriages don't like have a weekend off, right? Or that's a spouse that's dying of Alzheimer's. You don't get the weekend off when you're in that situation. Or it could be something really good. It could be like 3 kids under the age of 7. I think that's a wonderful thing, but that you're not getting any low cortisol days or recovery days if you have 3 young children running around. Okay. So those are the people that are going to go into a stage 1. The stress is consistent and daily. And then eventually the cortisol levels start to crash and they drop down. Okay. And people get exhausted. So we want to determine where on the scale are they. High cortisols we want to bring down, low cortisols we want to bring up, and then you want to reset the DHEA levels as well. And here's all the different hormone pathways. And you can see that pregnenolone takes a central role. That's probably I don't know. It's like having a favorite child, isn't it? Or for me, it's like having a favorite bicycle. It's my favorite supplement. It's my second favorite supplement. Okay. I'll just be honest. Pregnenolone is my second favorite supplement of my whole career. So if somebody came to me and said, you can only use 2 supplements the rest of your career, I would say, okay, Mucuna and pregnenolone. Just give me the pregnenolone. Pregnenolone, it's a central player in the balancing of all these different hormones. Look what it's the precursor, right? To what? Progesterone and cortisol and cortisone. It's the precursor to DHEA, androstenedione, all the estrogens, estrone, estradiol, estriol, and testosterone. So if you give the person the right amount of pregnenolone, you are able to balance out a whole bunch of downstream hormones in a very elegant and very efficient way. There's also extremely few people that have negative side effects from pregnenolone. We call it preg in my clinic because most people, when they look at that word, say pregnenolone, or they kind of stumble, they can't pronounce it. So preg, it has a whole body curing effect. And when you see its central role in steroid hormone synthesis, it sort of makes sense. It's not used that often for reasons I don't understand. My teachers, Dr. Timmons and Dr. Ilias, the ones that developed these protocols that I teach back in the 80s, I don't know. It was like a mainstay, but it's not something that really caught on. It's been around as a supplement for a long time, but it's not used enough. Okay. So, and then the other one, a product we're going to talk a lot about is DHEA. Obviously, we use DHEA too. Okay? So, let me see where we're at. Yeah. So, in terms of what triggers these problems, emotional stress triggering a problem with the stress hormones and with the catecholamines, leading to a weakening of the gut lining, acquisition of a pathogen, development of leaky gut, all the things that happen when we're stressed for long enough, we become catabolic and start to break down the gut lining, the gut tissue. And then eventually environmental toxins just kind of overwhelm the system. So we're testing all these body systems, but we're focusing on body system number one. And if you test and correct the adrenal hormones and you accompany that with lifestyle changes, you're going to be improving the health of most of the people that you're working with. It's a very good place to start because it really does allow you to do a broad survey and a very sort of broad intentioned treatment. Because when we're stressed, it's diet, exercise, sleep, and meditation that help reduce the stress. So that puts you right into the lifestyle factors, right? So I think of the adrenal labs like a HuMap as sort of a lifestyle test, testing the stress hormones. So it allows you to then prescribe these lifestyle changes. And then at the same time, it lets you know about the cause of the problem, right? Emotional, dietary, or inflammatory stresses. And so that drags you right into the gut inflammation issues and toxin related inflammation issues. So it's a nice centerpiece for other lab testing and a nice centerpiece for the lifestyle medicine. So we, in the mentorship class, basically we test everyone's adrenal hormones as the first lab that they do. And, if you're lucky and you're doing, a good job of talking people into doing tests, you would do an adrenal lab and a GI 360 and some kind of a toxin screen on every patient. Okay. Lifestyle guidelines, we talked a lot about that already. There's sort of general stress supplements. I don't know. You could probably look this up on the internet, in 10 seconds. Ginseng, ashwagandha, rhodiola, licorice, all these things. General nutrients required under stress. What I want to talk about today are specific lab-based protocols. So I'm not against these general things, and you should use these too, but we're not talking about them. We're talking specifically about dosages of products that you can use based on the labs, but we're not ignoring that. The other thing that I don't want to ignore is the thyroid, because there will often be a thyroid imbalance that comes along with an adrenal imbalance. And then the big question is, which one do you treat first? And there's certainly plenty of smart docs I've met over the years who are thyroid first kind of people, or maybe even thyroid only kind of people. I was raised by a bunch of naturopaths that were clearly adrenal first. They weren't adrenal only, though. They were like adrenal first, and then if you have to, deal with the thyroid. Honestly, that was the undertone to their work. So they created this idea of primary thyroid, meaning that only treat the thyroid if you have to. Only treat the thyroid if it does not respond to an adrenal program. And so secondary thyroid was their way of saying it's secondary to an adrenal program. And if you just get the adrenals working well, the thyroid will come along. I would kind of throw into that mix now that 25 years later, mitochondrial dysfunction as well, right? Because if your mitochondria aren't working, then none of this is going to work. If your mitochondria aren't working, your thyroid's going to be down forever and your adrenals won't respond either. So, there's some complexity to this. So you should, in the back of your mind, you should just think, hey, if this adrenal program is really not working, there could be a mitochondrial issue underlying this or something with the thyroid, okay? And here's how the HPA axis, the adrenal side, communicates with the HPT axis. There's direct connections to these inhibition pathways where when the glucocorticosteroids are out of range, there's a direct impact on thyroid function. Okay, so there's always going to be some interaction between those. And then I always think in terms of systems, talked a lot about this already, right? We're testing and correcting all these different systems. And the key is that this is what gets people in trouble is stress, driving the adrenal hormones, throwing off the gut, and then detox pathways. And then this is how we test and correct things. So that you have a clinical model that clearly states both how people get sick, which is right here. This is why do I feel so bad, doc? And then how are we going to get you better right here? And I'm particularly attached to my clinical model because I've been using it for a long time, but I don't want you to be attached to it, right? You just need your own clinical model of some kind. So when patients come in and say, hey, doc, why am I so sick? You can say, oh, well, let me show you. This is my philosophy of health. This is why I think Most people get sick, ... It could be genomics for all it matters, or it could be environmental toxins could be the main thing. You could say, I think we're all affected by environmental toxins, which is true. And that's the driving cause behind most illness in the world right now. But whatever it is, you want to have a clear model so you can explain to patients why you believe they're getting sick and what the bigger picture is, and then have a treatment model that parallels that. Okay, that's kind of the point of all that stuff. And if you don't have a treatment model, you can borrow this one if you want, or at least start to think about one so that when people have those questions, you can, have a consistent set of answers to that. Okay, so now all that being said, let's grab some labs and look at some protocols here. And we're going to focus on a very narrow part of this test, intentionally so, okay? Lylana and Angie, you can ding me if you can't see that, but hopefully you guys can see my screen again. Okay, so here's a basic protocol, all right? So let's go look at a lab and see how we build these. Simple protocols, but very effective. So now, here's the beauty of the test. I do love labs, I really do. Once you look at these for a long time, you just get to appreciate them more and more. And I review these, I may have my own small practice, but I spend 5 hours a week teaching various classes at the Kalish Institute, the mentorship and other advanced courses. And all that's happening is doctors are submitting labs. 5 hours a week. It's probably 5 cases an hour. I see probably 25 a week, 100 a month, a couple thousand of these a year, coming through my desk, and I'm interpreting them and talking to people about them and all that. So for this test, we're going to go super simple, okay? And we're going to skip a whole bunch of things, but we're just going to this one page here that has the cortisols. All right, you want to be able to see that. That's the page with the cortisol. And there's a cortisol picture there, or graphic. And then one other portion that I want you to peek at here, and I'll make this really big so you can see it easily. There, which is the DHEA. Oops, sorry. Okay. So number one, you look at the cortisols and just glance at the numbers. You can see here, blue is low, right? So you can clearly see that the cortisols throughout the day are low. And then what's extremely helpful is to also take a look at the actual rhythm or pattern. And the top graphic here is cortisone. I'm sorry, this one here is cortisone, and then what at the top of your screen now is the cortisol graph. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And it's kind of showing up a little small, so let me blow it up a little bit. And what you want to see in a perfect world is that the person is in the green the whole time. So if someone's hugging the blue range, they're quite low here, then that's what we would call stage 3. Stage 1 is very high cortisol. Stage 2 is cortisols are erratic and dropping. Stage 3 is the cortisols are low. Usually by the time people get to this point, they're quite exhausted and don't feel very good. And then the goal is quite simple. We want to raise up the cortisol levels throughout the entire circadian rhythm in this case, right? You want them to be a little higher all the time. And there's slightly separate protocols, and we should have time to go over each one of these briefly, okay? So you can see. I also want to point out some other highlights we'll be looking at, which is progesterone. You should be aware of that. And we're not going to get into all the estrogens and all that. Someone else who's an expert on female hormones can show you all that. Okay, and let me see. Here we go. And the DHEA levels, all right? So the easiest way to approach this is you first look at the cortisol, you see the rhythm, and then you look at the DHEA. And here you can see they report both DHEA and DHEA sulfate, dehydroepiandrosterone. So these two major hormones, if DHEA is low and cortisol is low, then that's the very definition of a stage 3. And then we want to get them both back up to the normal range. So remember, when you're first under stress, cortisol goes very high. Over time, it starts to deplete. And the longer that your HPA axis has been dysfunctional, the lower that the DHEA will become. In fact, I think from what I can tell after 30 years of looking at these, I think the DHEA in a lot of ways is one of the most stable indicators or consistent indicators of how exhausted the person has become. So it's very important to look at the DHEA levels and DHEAS, sulfate form, and then cortisol. So in this case, the person was low in both, right? So we go to the protocol sheet here, and you have DHEA. You can use it in a liquid, drops. You can use capsules. I prefer the liquids. If you're going to use capsules, then you want to multiply everything I'm saying by 4. So like 1 drop is equal to 4 milligrams of a capsule. So then typically for the DHEA, if you're using liquids, the liquids are 1.2 milligrams per drop. That's the ones that I use. But look at the label. You can figure it out. If the drops you're using are 1.5 milligrams, you can make an adjustment. Okay, but this is for a 1.2 milligram drop or 4 milligram capsule. You want to use 2 drops for the stage 3 of the DHEA and somewhere around 10 drops of the pregnenolone. Okay. So pregnenolone is going to help with the cortisol levels. It also helps with low progesterone. And then the DHEA obviously helps with the DHEA. So these are very small dosages spread throughout the day. We also want to include some kind of vitamin C, either in a powder form or in a capsule form. The key is to make sure that it includes bioflavonoids. And every company that we work with has vitamin C. Usually those are in a 500 milligram capsule, most typically. Very important for the adrenals to have enough C. Then some kind of a multi-pack, once or twice daily, depending, right? And then let's take that out. Now, for someone that has consistently low cortisol, we're going to be using a licorice root, not deglycerated licorice root, but regular licorice root. And I use a liquid, but again, you could use a capsule form if you prefer that. I use these drops. Pretty standard. You can get them from lots of companies. And licorice has a really nice effect on raising up low cortisol. You can also use some kind of glandular. I don't use glandulars all the time. A lot of people I work with are vegan, vegetarian, or they don't like the idea of glandulars. But every company will have one. If you want an extra boost for a stage 3, you can use an adrenal glandular, depending on the product, something like that. Again, the glandulars are probably less popular than they used to be 30 years ago. Some people still use them a lot, but I don't use them too much. And then typically we also use adaptogenic herbs. So let's take out the glandulars just to be more modern. Adaptogenic herbs. And again, every company will have an adrenal boost, adrenal this, adrenal adapt, adrenal whatever, adaptogenic herbs. And they're all going to be ginseng, rhodiola, ashwagandha, all the standard stuff, They're not going to be that different. And that would be a basic stage 3 protocol. And stage 3, again, is defined as low cortisol and low DHEA. Okay. You typically want to run these programs for around 3 to 6 months and then stop and retest. And in general, with these particular protocols, it's different for different programs. For these particular protocols, you want to stop all the supplements for 3 days or longer, maybe a week, retest and see if the HPA axis looks any different or any better. And what you're looking for then specifically are that the DHEA has come up and that the cortisol rhythm has come up, right? Okay, so let's look at another lab. And now here's on this test, here you can see the pattern. There we go. Make that a little bigger. Okay, so here's the cortisol pattern. So this is a nice way to just kind of get your bearings. Cortisol is high, it's dropping low, it's going up, and then coming back down close to normal. So these patterns, when there's, well, let's put it this way, the closer to in sync with the natural rhythm you are, the happier and healthier and better you feel. So if you look at this particular human being, in the morning, they're starting off high, cortisol, but then it's dropping precipitously. That doesn't feel good when it drops really low, and it's not supposed to be dropping low like that. People don't like that. Then you can see later in the day, it's going up. It's going up at a time when it's supposed to be coming down. So this person is constantly producing hormones in opposition to nature. I don't know what it's like. It's like if you've ever been in the ocean and you're trying to swim and then the tide's going the other way. Oh, this happened with my son and I this summer in kayaks. I forgot about that. Yeah, we were on this kayak trip. We're like, this is going to be easy. We just have to kayak like, I don't know. It was like a quarter mile, half a mile. It wasn't very far, but the tide was coming the wrong way and the wind was blowing the wrong way. And we couldn't do it. We had to turn around. It was just after like 2 or 3 hours, we just didn't get anywhere. Okay. So if you're not in sync with the natural rhythms of life with these hormones, it's like that. You just are not having a good experience of your day. So in these kind of cases, you want to lower the high cortisol you want to bring it down. You see the high there, especially the one in the evening, and you want to bring up the low. So let me show you how you do that. Oh, and let's look at the DHEA first too. Gives DHEA some credit here. Here, where's the DHEA at? DHEA is also low, okay? So DHEA is low, and we've got this erratic cortisol rhythm on this one. So let's take a look. But wait, I didn't really finalize that. Let's go back and say, what stage is it? Stage 2, because are the cortisols high all the time? No. Are they low all the time? No. Are they dropping out? Yep. Okay, so this is a stage 2. So we've got a stage 2. Remember, stage 1 is high cortisol. Stage 3 is super low cortisol. Stage 2, they're dropping out. It's right in between. So for stage 2, we're going to give a little more DHEA. And interestingly, we're going to give a little less pregnenolone. The vitamin C stays the same. The multi-pack stays the same. Now, the licorice root is dependent on when there's a high or when there's a low. And we're going to enter in one other product here, phosphatidylserine. This one lowers high cortisol. Okay. Licorice root raises low cortisol. So licorice root is used to bring it up. Phosserine is used to bring it down. All right. So now let's go back to the lab for a sec. And when do we want to bring the cortisol down? Well, most especially in the evening. It's kind of hard to do it in the waking hours because of the timing of everything, right? But in the evening, you don't want to have high cortisol. So we would want to give the phosserine around dinner time to lower that evening. And then we want to raise the middle cortisol. We want to raise that up. So you could give the licorice root in the morning or maybe just before lunch. So in this case, the licorice root would be, let's say earlier in the day, let's say right there, because we want to raise that dip in cortisol. And the phosserine would be given 1 or 2 capsules at night. That usually comes in 100 milligrams. Most companies make it like that. To lower the high cortisol, you would want to give that in the evening. So now you're manipulating the rhythm with licorice root, bringing it up, phosserine, bringing it down, correcting the DHEA and the cortisol with DHEA and pregnenolone. Okay, and the vitamin C and the multi-pack are just generic here and there all the time. And the same with the herbs. Adaptogenic herbs you can give anytime for any pattern. But the DHEA and pregnenolone dosages vary. And the licorice root and phosserine are only used in certain circumstances, right? And so it makes a huge difference. When you reset the rhythm, people feel like a whole new world is opened up in a good way. And then when the DHEA and pregnenolone start to do their job over the course of a few months, equally good. So this would be a 6-month protocol. And then you'd retest. And the retest should be done off all products because you want to see if you corrected anything or not. Because we're trying to reestablish normal production. We're trying to reset the HPA axis. That's the goal of these programs. Not to make people feel better, but to make the HPA axis flip back to its normal state. All right. And I do, like I said earlier, I do believe in volume of labs. So let's just keep going through. We'll go through 1 or 2 more, at least 1 more, and then we'll have time for questions. All right. So we got our pretty graphs here. We scoot down. We see progesterone. Actually, the progesterone here is normal. That's good. Just as an aside for progesterone, because it's a very important part of adrenal programs. If you see progesterone low on a woman I don't ever give progesterone to men. Some people do, but that seems a little weird to me. If a female has low progesterone and one of these adrenal problems, I would generally suggest adding progesterone into the program. Oh, here we go. This is stage 1, right? See how on the cortisol graph, high cortisol, the rhythm is still good. So there's no manipulating of the rhythm in terms of like up and down at the wrong times. It's just high all the time. That whole cortisol graph just needs to be brought down to the yellow, then down to the green. And then we're thinking, that's not good. What's going on with the DHEA? And the DHEA and DHEAS, DHEAS is like borderline low. It's green. It's like right on the arrow there. And then the regular DHEA is in the low range. So we've got some problems there as well. Oh, wait a minute, but I didn't tell you what stage it is. So, it's a stage 1, right? Because it's super high cortisol. Oh, great. So let's do a stage 1. So stage 1, high cortisol, low DHEA. One of the effects of DHEA as a supplement is to lower cortisol. One of the effects of DHEA, if you supplement with it, is it lowers cortisol. So if someone has really low cortisol already, think about it. You don't want to give them too much DHEA because you're going to lower it even more. Hence, the stage 3 protocols have tiny bits of DHEA. When somebody has high cortisol and that's a problem, you can use a lot more DHEA because you're trying to lower cortisol. So a stage 3 is 2 drops of DHEA 3 times a day. A stage 1 is double that. It's 4 drops of DHEA 3 times a day. Still not a huge amount of DHEA, but significant difference. And you're using that extra DHEA to lower the cortisol production at the same time as you're obviously trying to get more DHEA. And then as the cortisol goes high in a stage 1, you don't need that much pregnenolone. The more depleted their cortisol is, the more preg they need. Vitamin C and the multivitamins stay the same. Now, do you want to give, here's the quiz question. Do you want to give licorice root to a stage 3? And then I wish I could see your hands out there. I'd say, everybody who wants to give licorice root, put your hands up. And then I would say, okay, all of you people should leave the room because that's not a good idea. No, licorice root raises cortisol. So this person, the last thing you want to do for a high cortisol person is give them licorice root. That's bad. Take that out. Can you use phosphorine? Yeah, can, because it lowers high cortisol. So I don't know. You could give it to them. Usually I don't give it to people all the time, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Seems like a little overkill, but you could certainly do like lunch and dinner, something like that. If you really wanted to, you could give it 3 times a day, I guess, but that seems a little overkill. So I'd probably do lunch and dinner. So that phosphorine is going to lower cortisol, right? The DHEA will help lower the cortisol. The pregnenolone will help support the high cortisol production so it doesn't burn out. And then you've got your basic adrenal supports, the vitamin C, a multi-pack, and some adaptogenic herbs. And that's, we'll turn this red so we know, we're not going to do that. That one we're taking out because you don't want to use licorice root if cortisols are high. Licorice root is also, just as a random factoid, contraindicated in people that have high blood pressure also. So you never want to use licorice root if the person has high blood pressure, okay? All right. So we should probably open it up for questions. We have enough time for that.